Namaskar and welcome to Diplomatic Dispatch, the show that brings you in-depth expert analysis of all the major happenings on the international front. I'm Vikas Swarup. The 17th G20 Heads of State and Government Summit took place in Bali, Indonesia on November 15-16th and was attended by several world leaders, including Prime Minister Narendra Modi. So, in this edition of Diplomatic Dispatch, we will examine the outcomes and impact of this important summit. The Bali summit was the first post-pandemic meeting of the G20 grouping. This was reflected in the theme the Indonesian presidency had chosen: Recover Together, Recover Stronger. G20 leaders acknowledged that they were meeting at a time of unparalleled multidimensional crises, including the devastation brought by the COVID-19 pandemic, climate change, which has caused economic downturn, increased poverty, slowed global recovery, and hindered the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, and the war in Ukraine, which has further adversely impacted the global economy. Expectedly, it was the war in Ukraine which dominated the proceedings. President Putin did not attend the summit, deputing Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov to represent Russia. The final communiqué reproduced language from a UN General Assembly resolution deploring in the strongest terms the aggression by the Russian Federation against Ukraine and demanding its complete and unconditional withdrawal from the territory of Ukraine. But it also acknowledged that there were other views and different assessments of the situation and sanctions, and that the G20 was not the forum to resolve security issues. In line with the Indonesian G20 presidency theme, G20 leaders agreed on a 5-point agenda to ensure economic recovery by staying agile and flexible in their macroeconomic policy responses and cooperation, protecting macroeconomic and financial stability and remaining committed to using all available tools to mitigate downside risks, taking action to promote food and energy security and support the stability of markets, unlocking further investments for low and middle income and other developing countries, and recommitting to accelerating the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals and achieving prosperity for all through sustainable development. G20 leaders promised to take coordinated action to address food security challenges and applauded the Black Sea Grains Initiative. On climate change, they agreed to pursue efforts to limit the global temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius, confirming they stand by the temperature goal from the 2015 Paris Agreement on Climate Change. This could boost ongoing negotiations at the UN COP27 Climate Summit, which is taking place in Egypt. On debt, they voiced concern about the deteriorating situation of some middle-income countries and stressed the importance of all creditors sharing the burden. G20 leaders also recognized the need for the international community to step up their efforts to effectively combat money laundering, terrorism financing, and proliferation financing, and supported the Financial Action Task Force roadmap to tackle these threats. India played a key role at the summit. Prime Minister Modi participated in 3 working sessions at the leaders' level on food and energy security, digital transformation, and health, and outlined India's priorities as well as the tremendous work that India is doing in all these fields. On the sidelines of the summit, he also addressed the Indian community in Bali and held bilateral meetings with the leaders of the United States, United Kingdom, France, Germany, Italy, Australia, Indonesia, and Singapore. Foreign Secretary Vinay Quatra said at a press briefing that India worked closely with Indonesia in ensuring that the outcome document of the G20 summit was adopted by consensus. The President of Indonesia handed over the gavel to Prime Minister Modi in a symbolic handover of the presidency. India will formally assume the presidency of the G20 on December 1 this year. Prime Minister Modi has said that India's G20 presidency will be inclusive, ambitious, decisive, and action-oriented. Now, to examine the outcomes of the Bali G20 summit in greater detail, I am joined by 2 outstanding experts. Joining from Mumbai via video link is Manjeet Kripalani, the co-founder and executive director of Gateway House, an independent foreign policy think tank specializing in geopolitics and geoeconomics. She has worked previously at Worth and Forbes magazines and was the India Bureau Chief of Business Week. And joining us via video link from Delhi is Professor Harsh V. Pant, Vice President Studies and Foreign Policy at the Observer Research Foundation, who is also a Professor of International Relations with King's India Institute at King's College London. A very warm welcome to both of you. Let me begin with you, Manjeet ji. How important was this first post-pandemic G20 summit? And why have G20 deliberations acquired a greater salience in the current global economic context?
Thank you, Vikas, for having me. This has been a fantastic G20. I mean, it couldn't have come up for a better time for India. So 2 or 3 things. This is post-pandemic. It's also post-war, and it's post-sanctions. The world is an economic crisis. Most of this has really been, we were barely recovering from the pandemic, and now we're in an economic crisis because of the sanctions post the war. And we have a chance now with India as the head of the G20, we have a chance to bring our ability to have a low-cost economic structure, bring it to the table, and we can do this through our technology. We've also got 4 developing countries that are now going to be G20 president: Indonesia, India, Brazil, and South Africa. This means that the way our structures are built, the way our economies are, that is going to start now to dominate the way the world works. Our issues are going to be those issues, and this is couldn't have been at a better time, because the world really needs to lower the temperature. It also needs to lower its costs. So manufacturing, China's been in trouble. It's still in lockdown. There's 4 or 5 things, right? You've got manufacturing, you've got technology, you've got pharma because of the pandemic, and India is on top of this. We've just started to step up our manufacturing. We are now tentatively getting into trade regimes. So India leading the G20 this year is especially important for the G20, because it is time now for the G12 to start leading the G20 rather than the G7 to start leading the G20.
Very well said. Professor Pant, let me turn to you now for the political context. Now, many people say that in the wake of the tensions between the West and Russia and the US and China, and the chasm between what the global South needs and what the G7 are prepared to give, the G20 has also become a house divided. From this perspective, how do you evaluate the Bali summit?
I think in some ways, because Bali summit has tried to restore some faith in the global multilateral order, because I think the fundamental challenge today, because of all the fault lines that you mentioned, developed, developing, or Russia and the West, we are looking at the kind of fragmentation in the global multilateral order that we have not seen for a very long time. And it's very unfortunate, because it's exactly the time when you need global multilateral institutions to step up to the plate and start performing. Because not only you have, of course, political, geopolitical crisis all around, but also geoeconomic crisis all around. And one would have hoped that at a time of health and economic crises, multilateral institutions would be able to work better, because we know that under security, in security domain, it's relatively difficult. But what we are looking at is an across-the-board failure of the multilateral system. And I think this was something that Prime Minister Modi alluded to in his statement, where he pointedly took UN to task and said that, look, UN has completely failed in crisis after crisis over the last few years. So I think in some ways, the kind of fragmentation and polarization that we have seen leads you to believe, would lead you to believe that G20 would also be a failure, or would not be able to step up to the plate. But instead, I think with some deft leadership on the part of countries like India and Indonesia, there was a consensus document, and it reflected the aspirations of a large majority of members of G20, which included both the emerging powers as well as the established states. So very carefully crafted a declaration that resonated at a number of levels with a number of stakeholders, but because of certain circumstances, we could not, this year would not have been more ambitious, but hopefully next year would take up from here and lead us to a greater and more influential and more interesting territory, where global governance becomes a central concern, and where global governance is really taken forward in substantive terms.
Manjeet, now trade has been particularly hard hit by the COVID-19 pandemic and disruption of global supply chains. What measures did the G20 agree on to avoid trade disruptions?
Vikas, I'm going to read you what they said. They said, we will make public investments and structural reforms promote private investments, and strengthen multilateral trade and resilience of global supply chains to supplement long-term growth, sustainable and inclusive, green and just transitions. I mean, that's a lot of words, and none of these have actually been met. Trying to understand where India fits into this, right? There's a China plus one, but India itself can be at the center of supply chains for South Asia. We need to bring South Asia into the global supply chain, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh in particular. The problem with the G20 just now is that because the UN has been so dysfunctional, as Harsh said, all the UN issues are now being brought to the G20 to resolve. That is not the answer. The G20's job is to prevent another global financial crisis. Well, we're in a crisis, right? We've got the sanctions that have created the crisis, and we really have to focus on it. And one way of doing it is for India to think hard about how it can become the center of the supply chains in South Asia and in Africa. I think Asia already is. They're really strong on ASEAN. And we have to now start engaging with our region on either side, West Asia, Africa, and East Asia. And I think that our Australia has really helped us by signing an early harvest trade agreement.
Yes.
We have to hold our noses and jump into the trade world because China is very restrained. They will come back, doubtless, once they are in, but they've got domestic problems. The Western world has its own issues, and it's going to take a very long time for Europe to recover. India is a safe place, and we really need to start taking the lead, but we need to get or import trade experts who understand our viewpoint. So I think that we have a chance through trade to get rid of a lot of the statements on, green and just transitions. This is very good, but it's really hard to make those transitions. So we have to work with the way we know how, which is affordable, accessible, manufacturing, jobs, products, energy for the people in this part of the world, right? The G12, and therefore start to participate and create a new kind of G20 and bring it back economics.
Professor Pant, now even though Indonesia's President Joko Widodo tried to keep the focus of the summit on key issues such as climate change and food security, the Ukraine war still ended up casting a long shadow. In fact, on the last day of the summit, the G7 countries at the summit were focused exclusively on the missile attack on a village in Poland and even held an internal meeting. In the face of such polarization, do you think the Indonesians did rather well to even being able to come up with a joint communique? And what role did India play in bringing about this consensus on Ukraine?
I think Indonesians did really manage to get their act together and did manage to do a good job in bringing a lot of consensus around the themes that I think are central to G20. And I think what Manjeet was saying earlier, in terms of bringing the focus back to geoeconomics, in a sense, has been an important contribution this year, despite, as we were discussing, the fact that in today's world, geoeconomics and geopolitics are becoming intertwined. It's very difficult to break the two. It's very difficult to disentangle the two. And therefore, for Indonesians, it was a particularly difficult task to do. But I think they managed to do, if you look at the priorities, the way they were set up. And I think India's role became important because India had, in some ways, the famous line of Mr. Modi that was there in the document as well. This is not the time for war. I think it underscored this reality that the world itself has to start focusing on economic growth, on developmental issues, because ultimately they are the ones the poorest countries of the world, the most vulnerable countries of the world are suffering economically because of these crises that we are witnessing. And these crises are not only about Russia, Ukraine, they're also about US-China contestation. They're also about the failure of multilateral organizations to do their job. So I think the brunt is being borne by the most vulnerable countries in the world. And I think in that context, India contributed by bringing a lot of the developing emerging powers back to the table in terms of making a case that this is going to be an important aspect of the world going forward. And I think there was something very interesting that happened, but we should notice in the declaration, that while you have the geopolitical aspect where, UN Charter was reiterated, and then this idea that this is not the time for war, and that Russia is condemned in some ways, and also this idea that, there are other views. But on the other hand, it was linked quite categorically with some of the things that the developed world has done in the economic space. So, the US Federal Reserve, for example, raising the interest rates extremely and creating this volatility in the market. I think in that sense, trying to make a case for some order, for some discipline in the monetary sector, and in the wider how the central banks should run their economies. I think that was part of that discourse, which in some ways balanced out the developed and the developing concerns in a way that perhaps India and Indonesia were able to do together. And India, of course, brought its heft, given that India is looked at, I think, as Manjeet was pointing out earlier, in some ways at the center of global economic conversations. And that helped in making economics the pivot around which a lot of the declaration revolved.
Manjeet, now in the wake of the Russia-Ukraine war, the sharp rise in energy prices has increased the cost of living across the world, leading to inflation. What was the Bali summit's policy prescription to ensure stability in the energy markets? And why did Prime Minister Modi speak about no restrictions on energy movement?
Well, the same things that have been said before have been reiterated at Bali. What was interesting is that COP27 was going on at the same time at Sharm el-Sheikh. And what was absolutely absent, except through countries like India reiterating it during the summit conversations, was the fact that actually Africans are absolutely furious at during the COP27, because they're being asked to make transitions to energy when they don't have any energy. They're totally arid. They don't have any food. They have no money for fertilizer. So I feel that there's a lot of this very pious talking, and again, it's the G7 trying to dominate the conversation without even considering that they've created a problem for the rest of the world. So I think that what we are seeing, we're actually running a task force on energy transitions and climate finance. First and foremost, the G20 and the developed nations have to be held to their promise of delivering climate finance. If they don't do that, all bets are off. In any case, the developed world has so many exemptions for itself, right? Netherlands had 92 exemptions to the sanctions so they could get their energy going. Everybody is restarting their coal. Europe is starting their coal. They think nuclear has been made renewable energy. I mean, that's fine, but this hypocritical treatment just has to stop. And I think it's particularly important for India, which has now started to do a lot of plain speaking, to continue doing that plain speaking and do what is necessary, not only for its own economy, because we are so dependent on fossil fuels, that we have to also legitimize that and say, look, we've got the transitions going on. Yes, it's good, but cough up the money. We will work on the transition. When we do manufacturing, we'll do green transitions. But in the meanwhile, we still need the lights on, and we are going to continue with our fossil fuels. And I think the chance of that realism being injected into the G20 by India is it's legitimate, and it will happen.
Professor Pant, the summit was preceded by a bilateral meeting between US President Joe Biden and Chinese leader Xi Jinping, the first time the two had met since Biden became president. Now, in light of recent tensions over Taiwan and the US export control restrictions on China's ability to make high-end semiconductors, how significant was this meeting?
I think anytime you have the two most important countries in the world, in some ways, economic powers, political and diplomatic and military powers meeting, certainly, a lot of the countries and the rest of the world is anxious to know as to what really, the agenda was and what really the outcome was. And in this case, I think, given where the US and China relationship stood before the summit, made that anticipation even more palpable, because there is certainly a real challenge here in terms of the two major economic powers. If they start a competitive rivalry, then it sort of degenerates into something that others will also bear the brunt of. So I think there was a lot of expectation in some senses that Biden and Xi Jinping, after their after they have had their domestic consolidation in some ways, the elections are out of the way, they would be able to consolidate, or at least lower the temperature on their bilateral, rivalry. And I think some of that we saw the outcome. If you see the wordings, the way Chinese have reacted, the way Americans, the way Mr. Biden outlined his America's policy that they don't want a rivalry, that there's no question of a Cold War. I think there was a sense that they need to temper it down. They need to ensure that, especially I think the global economic order, already under pressure, does not collapse further because of the weight of the contradictions between the two powers. But I think ultimately the relationship remains where it is. I do not see a strategic change in the relationship. I think it's a tactical adjustment to contemporary realities, and the two nations will remain competitive, and I think the rest of the world will have to adjust to that reality. But so far, diplomatically, the two leaders certainly were able to bring the temperature down, and also in some ways reassure, in particular the Asian countries, in particular the ASEAN countries that have been very, very cagey about the US-China rivalry, holding forth and becoming the center point of Indo-Pacific engagement.
Manjeet, now Prime Minister Modi participated in the sessions on food and energy security, health and digital transformation. Tell us about his message and how India can provide leadership within the G20 in these critical areas.
So energy, I think we've had a discussion on it, and India will do its best. We've already started a large reforestation program, and I think India, there's a lot of the developing world that understands that. President Lula of Brazil, which is going to follow his presidency, has said he's going to host international meetings in the Amazon because he wants to show everybody what is going on in terms of reforestation. So I think many of our normal natural processes are going to take place. Because there was also day before yesterday, there was a discussion on the contribution that tribal India can make to these natural processes of the environment. I think we'll see some of that coming out in India, and that is also going to resonate in a large part of the developing world, which has tribals who are referred to as protectors of the environment. So we might see a lot of that taking place apart from the traditional energy transitions, and this is going to be part of the energy transition. What we do on health, there's no question about it. We've shown what we can do during the pandemic. We were really the only country that gave out the vaccine either free or on time. This has earned India an enormous goodwill. We have to now allow our pharma companies, which are very ambitious, to step up to the plate and really start thinking about how we are going to work with technology on health. And in this, the India stack is actually doing very well. So we've already tested these at continental scale in India, right? During the pandemic, we were able to use the India stack, the Jan Dhan Yojana, etc., that model to provide rations. We now are developing a health stack, whereas all our documentation, etc., in India, a doctor anywhere can take a look at it depending on your card. So we are progressing tremendously on this. So the combination of our technology and health is going to be on show during our G20 year. So a lot of what India is going to do is going to be a show, don't tell. We do have that available. And on technology, well, two things. One is the digital public goods, which we have done so well in, and we have to now start exporting it. As you know, the Aadhaar card is Indian government IPR. We have started something called the MOSIP, which is the Modular Open Source Identity Platform, which is based out in Bangalore, where we can export this model to different countries, because the UN now also requires, Article 19 says that everybody needs a foundational ID in order to get UN aid. And the UN has really become an aid agency now. This, if we can build these stacks, and which we intend to do, I think India's contribution to the world will be tremendous, because the cost of even doing banking transactions in the Western world has become so expensive that people almost don't want to take the money out of the bank. So India is shown to show the way, and I think the Western world, Canada, Singapore, etc., all looking at these very closely. We are going to see our own digital transformation is going to be on full display and under scrutiny from the rest of the world. So it's going to be very exciting.
Following on from that, Professor Pant, now India will formally take over the presidency of the G20 on December 1 and has a unique opportunity to shape the agenda of the G20 over the next 1 year. Can India emerge as the consensus builder to unite the G20 and provide global governance on all the critical issues facing the world?
I think it is important that India emerges as that consensus builder because there is hardly any consensus in politics, global politics at the moment. So if India really wants to achieve all that it has laid out for itself as a G20, as part of its G20 presidency, it will be important for India to emerge in that role. And I think what India has shown in the last year or so is that it has that unique ability to engage multiple stakeholders in ways that perhaps takes the conversation forward. Because what we often see is that, and what we are witnessing increasingly, because of the polarization and fragmentation, that you don't want to cross the aisle and talk to the other side. And that creates challenges of a kind on all the issues that we have been discussing in this session, whether energy, climate, sustainable development, technology, cooperation, trade. How do you move forward if you're not able to reach out to the other side and have a conversation which is about finding solutions to global problems? So I think fundamentally India's role, and I think given the fact and everything that Manjeet was saying earlier, that India is in a unique position to be an exemplar in some ways, that we have done it at home. We have come out of this of multiple crises in a way that perhaps few expected us to, and we have done very well for ourselves. So can we now export this model? Can we now make it an example for the developing world in particular? And can we become a voice for the developing world that engages with the developed world in a sense where we want to find solutions? And I think this also applies equally to Russia and the West, because ultimately, I think, as has been pointed out by India and others, that ultimately this problem will have to be resolved through dialogue and through some kind of a political consultation, which at the moment is not happening because of the battleground realities, what they are. But ultimately, the two sides will have to sit down and try to find a solution. And I think that there also India becomes the voice of the global South, because it's the South that is suffering the most, in terms of energy, food, fuel, fertilizer crisis, and economic crisis that we are witnessing. So I think it will be imperative for India to emerge as a consensus builder, and I hope it does. And all the signs are that we will try its best to emerge as that kind of a consensus builder, as that bridge that one hopes it would, and make the G20 presidency perhaps more fruitful and more consequential than the previous G20s that we have seen in the past.
So thank you, Professor Pant and Manjeet ji, for sharing your insights into the economic and political dimensions of the G20 summit in Bali. As the curtain comes down on the Indonesian presidency, the focus now shifts to India's presidency of the G20. Prime Minister Modi has already said at the closing session in Bali that India will strive to ensure that the G20 acts as a global prime mover to envision new ideas and accelerate collective action, to take forward India's G20 theme of one Earth, one family, one future. That is all I have for you in this edition of Diplomatic Dispatch. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.